Welcome back to Washington, D.C. You are watching France 24 and a debate here in Washington on what we can do next to turn the Paris Agreement into reality. We're going to move swiftly on with our panel here in Washington. And I want to ask about renewable energy and what can be done to increase renewable energy investments, because the International Energy Agency recently reported that 90% of all new electricity generation in 2015 came from renewable sources. Still, renewables represent a fairly small part of the global energy mix. What's needed in order to fuel this transition? Now, I want to put that question to Mark Carney from a financial point of view. How do you motivate private players to keep investing in renewables?
Well, ultimately, for private players, it's going to be a commercial decision. And that goes back to what Jim was talking about in terms of the technology crossover points, actual and perspective. And perspective is crucial here. And what I was raising earlier and what the ministers have been outlining in terms of their plans. But let me speak to something specifically, which relates to green bonds and moving that from niche to mainstream. There are various estimates. All the numbers get up into the hundreds of billions and trillions. The point being, there's 100 trillion of fixed income assets in institutional hands, 100 trillion US dollars. Less than 1% of that is invested in anything that would approximate a renewable or green finance. Okay, so there's plenty of capital. Now, there's an economic reason for that, but there's also the mechanisms that can be driven as societal attitudes change, and as those investors who want to be out front, how do they know they're investing in something that's green? So we're an initiative under the Chinese presidency this year to make the standards basically for a green bond market so that it's mainstream. That means standardized terms. That means standardized disclosure, standardized certification. It means integrating green considerations into credit ratings. Credible dispute resolution mechanism. So if you're investing in emerging markets or developing countries, you can have credible. And moving towards global standards for all of that, so you can move green finance from niche to mainstream. We're in a world, and I'll finish with this, and I'll speak as a central banker, we're in a world of very low interest rates with huge pools of institutional capital that are looking for longer term assets that provide some yield and provide some diversification. That's exactly what the promise of a power opportunity, as Jim was saying, in a place like Pakistan can provide, or anywhere else around the world. But it has to be on terms that are readily recognizable, standards that are international, and we as regulators working with the private sector can move to establish those, and then it turns back into whether the frameworks are being put in place, and that can shift huge amounts of capital into areas like renewables.
Minister McKenna, you were nodding at one point. Talk to us about your reaction to that.
Well, I mean, renewables are key. In Canada, actually, most people may not know this, that 80% of our electricity is coming from non-emitting sources, so hydro, nuclear, other sources. But we're looking at doing more. So with the NDCs, you're going to have to figure out what more you can do. So phase out of coal is going to be important. We just had a very green budget, investments in renewables and innovation. But I come back to the market too. So I was just actually at a wind conference, and the price differential in some projects is actually, there is no price differential. So it just makes economic sense. There are some challenges where a government can play a role through, innovation and funding innovation, but I think the market is going to be important, because then it'll just be a no-brainer that you'll look at renewables. But the big thing that I think is key is carbon pricing. And this is something that I'm going to do a shout out to Glenn Murray, who's the Minister of Environment for Ontario. They are moving to a cap and trade system with California. We have 80% of Canadians live in a jurisdiction that has a price on carbon or will have a price on carbon. We have committed as a government to ensuring that we have a price on carbon across the country. And I think that's so critical. I'm part of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Initiative. I think there's a really great discussion that's going on with the business community, and now we have to just bring it to governments, because the business community is saying to us, you know what, we need a price on carbon because we need certainty. It's the cheapest, most efficient way to lower emissions, and it'll foster innovation. And so, but we need to do this in a way that everyone comes on board because there are competitiveness issues. And so this is something that, as a government, we are working very diligently on. I think very good signal with China coming on board with carbon pricing next year. But there's certainly a lot of work to be done. And so call out to all the business people in the room, go out and shout from the rooftops that this is what you are doing. You're already pricing carbon, and that you should be pushing your governments to do it.
Minister Royal, let me put the question to you. We just heard there from Minister McKenna that she said that perhaps the government could take a step back when it comes to subsidies, if I'm paraphrasing you correct, Minister McKenna.
Totally said that, but...
Okay, but governments could take a step back when it comes to subsidies of renewable energy and so on and so forth. How does France look at that? How do you look at that? Can the government in France, which has been supporting renewables with things like subsidies and other financial support, can the government now take a step back?
Well, no, I don't think so at all. We have to do quite the opposite. We have to move forward, I think. And what was decided at COP were, well, there were three things. There are three things we have to do. Public financing, first of all, private funding, and we also have carbon pricing and public funding. Well, we've made various commitments. There are commitments for the African continent, for example. It's very important that multilateral organizations do their share. The African Bank of Development has to do its part. This is very important for credibility, for our credibility. And then there's private funding. So there are meetings of investment funds that took place during COP. A lot was done in a very short amount of time. The decarbonization of our portfolios, $6.5 billion. This went well beyond its initial goal, $100 billion. And then there was also the issue of getting central banks involved in fighting climate change. As chair of COP, I think we have to look at the opportunities through green growth. Very often we talk about climate change as being a risk. I think it's an opportunity. The solar coalition, for example, India, for example, has shown great leadership here. Other countries also are joining. During COP in Paris, there were 60 meetings on 60 coalitions that were created on marine energy, on solar energy. There were other themes. There were also the oceans, forests, biomass, resiliency, for example, the issue of transportation, building energy efficiency also. So there were coalitions that were developed, state coalitions, corporate coalitions, city coalitions also. This is growing and it's accelerating. There are 12 themes that will be reporting on the 21st or 21st of April on. After the official signing ceremony, the afternoon will be given over to a report on the actions that have been taken. Third challenge we have now is carbon pricing. We'll have the opportunity to talk about this tomorrow. I'd say three things, however. I think that carbon pricing has to be high enough to change behavior. Secondly, there has to be a foreseeable and stable pricing level. Thirdly, there has to be a coordinated price, as the World Bank has proposed, to make this an instrument that doesn't lead to competition. I've passed legislation which sets the price of carbon at 50 cents a ton in 2020. We think, or rather euros. We think we need to reach about 30 euros, and I think that we really have to deal with this issue properly. We have to deal with it head on. Carbon pricing really is can, of course, and only be dealt with through taxation, but that's a taboo, and we have to deal with that. We have to allow countries to set a price on carbon. In Europe, we're creating an initiative on this, and we're trying to look at the energy mix. Now, I think this week at the World Bank, we have to move forward, and we have to put forward a price for carbon, and we have to see how we do that based on
that was the European perspective, so to speak. What about the African perspective? Minister Boissy, you're from a continent which has a growing thirst for energy. How do we make sure that thirst is quenched not by fossil fuels, but by renewables?
Mais justement, quand on parle des pays qui ont
We're talking about countries who are in transition, who have energy needs. Africa, for example, has the level of electrification which is very, very low. Africa is evolving over the past 10 years. There's been extensive development in Africa, growth of 5% a year, more or less. So Africa needs energy to fuel that growth and to fuel that development. So it's easy and it's difficult at the same time for a country that needs to create energy capacity, because the choice really in energy policy is, well, the first priority really is to satisfy demand. The second priority also has to be to provide for an effective energy mix, but at a specific price, of course, a specific cost. And now the issue of choice comes in here, moving towards renewable energy. Well, that means that there's a gap, there's a cost gap between energy, the classical sources of energy can provide. Well, through technology, I think that this gap is being reduced. There's been significant movement forward on solar energies, which now we can store solar energy, electricity. We can store 16 hours now, but the gap has to be funded. Therefore, the promise that was made to the tune of $100 billion, and this is there to support the Paris Agreement. This has to come into reality now. And this pledge has to come into force. Africa really and other countries need this support, so that the choices they make can really be in line and in compliance with what was decided at Paris, I think.
Let me turn then the question to the Environment Minister of Canada. Is Canada ready to stump up the cash, so to speak, to pay for the development towards renewables?
Well, we're very committed to helping less developed countries. We heard that. We wouldn't have had an ambitious Paris Agreement without developing countries feeling that they were going to be supported, the less developed countries in particular. We announced $2.65 billion that will go to support less developed, the least developed countries as a focus, because, I mean, it's quite clear that the cost to shift to renewables to adapt to the impact of climate change, I mean, it's huge. But the reality is it can't just be government money. There's just not enough money. And so that is why we absolutely have to leverage private sector investment. And Jim and I are going to have a conversation actually this afternoon about how we can help as a country. Because I think when you have grants, when governments step up, provide money, and then you have development banks or private institutions that are willing to also to help out, you can leverage the financing, and that's how we're going to have to do it. It's a reality. There's just not enough money. Governments have to spend a lot of money at home. There's a lot of competing priorities, but I do feel quite confident that we are going in this direction. Everyone recognizes that we need to take action, and now we have to be very thoughtful on how do we prioritize and how do we really leverage the money, because money isn't just the solution. I mean, it is part of the solution, but doing it in a way that actually makes sense. So helping governments make better decisions because they can afford them. So choosing to go to solar as opposed to coal is huge. And that's the kind of decision that we need to be facilitating the developed countries.
What's the World Bank's role when it comes to leveraging the money? President Kim.
I think there's a general realization. When we were going into the Sustainable Development Goals, the Secretary General asked all the multilateral development banks to develop a plan to fund the Sustainable Development Goals. And when we looked at the 17 goals, 169 targets, we thought, wow, this is a multi-trillion-dollar agenda. So we actually made a whole list of things that could be done, everything from increasing domestic resource mobilization to stopping illicit financial flows, which is now very much in the news with the Panama Papers, to grant-based aid, and then all the other forms, including concessional financing, and then ultimately really being very focused and effective in crowding in the private sector. What we found was that you're going to need all those different sources if you're going to be able to have any shot at reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And then with the COP21 goals being so much more ambitious than we had even hoped, the bill just got bigger. So we've pledged that by 2020 we would be providing $29 billion overall for climate finance. And so we'll be the largest funder of climate-related activities. But I think that the role that we need to play together, the great thing about French leadership was that for an entire year, the French government was the focus of an intense conversation about how to go forward. And I feel like now we've got to rally around. And, you know, we just met with Minister Boussaïd. Morocco has done such amazing things building its own solar industry that I think now what we should do is get together and don't let that intense global conversation fall to the wayside and rally, under the leadership of Morocco and continue to have that conversation. And the conversation we have to have is exactly what Minister McKenna talked about. If there is grant funding available, how can we use that to leverage the multilateral development banks and then together leverage the private sector by putting on the table investments that make sense for the people who hold this $100 trillion in cash? We have found that even in very difficult settings, you can reduce the risk of investment so that you actually attract, otherwise very conservative investors. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is we have to have a place to have this conversation, and we have to do something that we learned about as a medical doctor, which is triage. What are the things that we absolutely have to do right now, and what are the other things that we have to do to make the response feel just and fair? And I think that, of course, the mitigation issue is huge, but I think we have to also be very serious about getting projects going around adaptation. For Africa, for many of the poorest countries, they are being, absolutely battered with the impact of climate change with El Nino, and we need to start building climate-resilient infrastructure so that we get the adaptation agenda going as well. Now, this process of triage and everyone talking to each other every day, I think one of the things we have to just decide, and maybe this is a good place to do it, is that we cannot rest now after this great year that we had under France's leadership. We've got to now find a way to keep that conversation going, and doing it with Morocco's leadership, I think, is exactly what we should do.
I want to put a question to Minister Royal when it comes to the role of the European Union in this. Collectively, right. European countries and the European Union is the biggest aid donor globally. Is it time to perhaps upgrade renewables within that aid mix, so to speak, and provide more financing for renewables? Is that something that's up for discussion at the European level?
Well, yes, it is. We're talking about this at the European level, and it's complicated because each European country has its own energy model. There are coal-producing countries like Poland, for example. It's difficult for them to ensure the energy transition. Now, of course, there are very ambitious goals. The reduction of 40% in greenhouse gas emissions is easier for some countries than for others. Each country is ratifying the agreement, of course. Then there needs to be a pan-European ratification, so we need to distribute the efforts need to be taken by each country. This isn't easy. We'll get there, though, and I think it's our responsibility to do this. Europe, like other industrialized countries, have based their industrialization on fossil fuels. We're responsible for part of climate change. Of course, at the time, we didn't know about it, but other continents are feeling the impact of climate change without being responsible for it. Africa, for example, this is one of the priorities. It's one of my priorities as the chair of COP before I hand over to my Moroccan friends. Now, these are the most vulnerable countries in the world. Africa, 1 in every second African has access to electricity. So there's great potential for geothermal energy, for solar energy. And then there are the islands, of course. They have talked about the situation they face. It's an issue of life or death, of survival, really. Some people think we have time. For other countries, it's really an issue of survival, immediate survival. This is why we have to accelerate. We have to combine public and private financing. We have to look at carbon pricing, but we also have to really move on this. We have to show resolve to act. Now, there's a strong link between the well-being of the world's world's population and the energy transition process. Why? Because access to electricity gives you access to development, education, drinking water, agriculture, other things also, access to security also. So it's a major civilizational issue. It's a major issue, I think. We can't really divide the sustainable development goals per sector. There's a strong link between the sustainable development goals and the climate change issue, because at the end of the day, really, it's an issue of survival, not of sharing, because we all live on the same planet. It's an issue of climate justice, I think. We have to understand that, and I think that for the first time, we have to be optimistic about this. There's convergence, if you like, between private interests who have finally understood that green growth is also a great opportunity for them. It's a driver of economic growth. And then there are planetary goals also. Countries at different stages of development, for example, we're all moving in the same direction. It's a common cause. That's what's great about Paris. We're living in a world where there's great insecurity, great violence, great conflict, and all of a sudden there's something that happened. All countries came together, no matter what their situation. Well, they've all understood that there was a common goal. We have to work together to find how we can perhaps work together as men, women, and children to really put ourselves on a better footing with nature.
What if states don't actually live up to what they have promised to, or what they did promise in Paris? What possibilities are there within the remits of the Paris Agreement to actually make them live up to their promises? President Kim.
Well, I think the important thing is to assume that most will not, and then to do everything we possibly can to change the incentives so that they make the decision not necessarily, it would be great if they all made decisions on the basis of their commitments in Paris, and there was a lot of intensity and pressure to go and make a commitment, but there really was the sense that once you did this, then the pressure would be off. So I think that the way we're operating is we have got to do everything that we can to change the incentives and switch the incentives so that it's that very practical financial decisions are being made to do the right thing. I think if we wait until everyone lives up to the agreements, we're gonna be in trouble.
I just want to finish up with asking you, all of the participants here on stage, what you think that we should be taking away from this discussion, and also ahead of COP22, COP23, COP24. What should we be taking away, as I say? President Kim.
So I just want to say, in the audience, Gerard is here from EDF, formerly EDF, but so Gerard is part of an energy company, but he's defining energy company more broadly, and so I think the losers in all of this are going to be the people who refuse to look at the science. I think the losers are going to be the people who refuse to understand the implications for human beings and the planet of climate change. In my 3.5 years here, every time I've come out and said, it's actually worse than we thought 6 months ago, it turns out that it's even worse than what I said 6 months before. And so, what more do we need? There was no winter in the Arctic this year. The average temperature was 30 degrees Celsius higher than normal. We've had 3 straight years of ocean temperatures that are so high that the killing of the coral reefs is potentially the worst that we've ever seen. Island nations, and this was what was so poignant at the Paris meeting, the island nations are really talking about existential threat. I was in Florida with my 7-year-old son, my family. My 15-year-old son was talking about how the waters are seeping up into Miami and property is going to be lost. And so my 7-year-old son was listening, and he yelled out from the back seat, "Dad, you're president of the World Bank. Why aren't you doing more about climate change?" Right? That is the question that every child should be asking every one of us every single day, right? So the only people who are going to lose, I think, are the people who don't have the vision to see the great opportunity that Mark just talked about. There's a huge opportunity going forward. We need people like Gerard who are going to think more broadly about what it means to be an energy company, and for countries that are specifically focused on exporting fossil fuels. I think we would be very happy to help them think about ways of diversifying their economy. But this is an absolutely critical issue. We have to move now, because the real losers will be every single one of our children and grandchildren.
we have to move now in another respect, because we are actually out of time. My apologies to the rest of the participants who didn't get a chance to summarize your thoughts. I'm sure you'll have plenty of opportunity to do that on another occasion. I want to thank you, all of you, for being part of this panel. I want to thank the audience here in Washington, D.C. for being here, and I want to thank you at home for watching France 24. Stay with us.